1 year after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the war still rages. During that time, China has not been outwardly supportive of Russia's military actions. That might all change after a meeting between Wang Yi, China's highest-ranking diplomat, and Vladimir Putin. This meeting has set the groundwork for what might become an alliance that divides the world in two. Wang Yi's formal title is Director of the Office of Central Foreign Affairs, Commission of the Chinese Communist Party. He's one of the most powerful people in China, but like everyone else, still answers to Xi Jinping. The interesting thing about Yi's most recent visit to Moscow is that it only comes days after President Joe Biden's surprise visit to Ukraine. Biden's visit made a huge statement that the United States, and by extension the West, will no longer fear Russia and is more than willing to make it publicly known. They will continue to support Ukraine economically, militarily, and with humanitarian aid, regardless of how upset it makes Putin. Yi's meeting with the leadership of Russia has started under the guise of peace and finding a diplomatic way of resolving the conflict in Ukraine. However, China has made it clear that they do not believe Russia should be forced to give back all the territory it seized and that both sides will need to make concessions. In reality, China wants the war to end because it's disrupting their future plans, and they need Russia's help in combating the spread of Western ideologies. China cares very little about the success of Russia itself and more about using it as a tool. The new alliance being discussed will not happen unless the terms are favorable for China, and as you'll find out, what China wants could be very bad for the United States and its allies. During the meeting in Moscow, there was talk of crisis and chaos in the world that could lead to opportunities that China has been planning to seize for a while now. The war in Ukraine has shown China that Western powers will band together when necessary. It's also revealed that the United States is willing to do pretty much whatever it takes, besides going to war, to support a country that's fighting to resist an authoritarian regime. The Chinese leadership dreams of a world where the United States is not the only superpower, and that China, at the very least, shares the title in a bipolar global order. However, in order to achieve this dream, they will likely need Russia's help, which is why a new type of relationship between the two nations is currently being forged. China has no interest in sharing its global power with Russia, but there are some very key resources that Russia can provide and China needs in order to reach its full potential. Therefore, the meeting in Moscow between Wang Yi and Vladimir Putin is believed to be a precursor to a more formal meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. This is the meeting that many Western nations are keeping a close eye on. President Biden's visit, along with all the military aid and assistance that NATO has given Ukraine, necessitated a closer partnership between Russia and China. But before we can understand where the newly formed alliance between Russia and China is going, we need to know where things currently stand between the two nations. Let's start off by making one thing clear. Russia and China are not true allies. The most obvious example of this being true is the fact that China has not gone to war alongside Russia in Ukraine. China's not even openly sent Russia military aid or equipment like the West has done for Ukraine. We still have strong evidence that Chinese companies have been helping Russia bypass sanctions, but China is not actively supporting Russia in their war. This makes one thing glaringly clear: China and Russia do not currently support each other or have a traditional alliance in the same way that countries in NATO do. Instead, China and Russia have a mutually beneficial pact that's based around similar principles. Neither country is legally obligated to come to the defense of the other, and as China has shown, they aren't under any obligation to help in a conflict. However, both nations see one another as strategic partners, especially in reshaping the global status quo. Like in many relationships, one side is much more invested than the other, and in this situation, Russia needs China much more than China needs Russia. Vladimir Putin isn't known for his diplomacy or for always being the most trustworthy person. That's why when he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in February 2022, just before launching his invasion into Ukraine, Vladimir Putin said that the partnership between Russia and China had no limits. This obviously wasn't true, which China made abundantly clear by offering very limited support for Russia's war against Ukraine. And even though Xi and Putin have met over 40 times since 2012, they are far from the best of friends. All of the actions that each nation has taken recently show that they have their own interests at heart and care very little about the success of others, even their closest partners. But that might be changing. In a world where Western ideologies are spreading, China and Russia might need to create an actual alliance to ensure their own survival. Right now, it's very likely that China sees its relationship with Russia as more of a convenience than a necessity. It's the shared perception of the encroaching West and the very real deployment of NATO, and more specifically US troops around the world, that have driven Russia and China into each other's arms. In fact, many experts agree that the China-Russia alliance is not a natural one, but is the result of each country's deteriorating relations with the West. It's a shared enemy that binds the two nations together. This has led to certain economic agreements and cooperation between China and Russia. For 2 decades, trade has been growing between the two nations, reaching an all-time high in 2021 of $147 billion. Although it is important to remember that this money is not evenly shared between Russia and China. Economic reliance, like with most things in the Chinese-Russian relationship, is very lopsided. Russia needs China's economic support much more than the other way around. To put this into perspective, currently Russia's top trading partner is China. Before the invasion of Ukraine, their top trading partner was the European Union, but China was still a close second. However, Russia is China's 10th largest trading partner, with the EU, the United States, and South Korea being the top three. There's a huge disparity between the amount of economic reliance each nation has on the other, and Russia doesn't just rely on Chinese exports, it also needs its banks and investments to keep the economy going. In the grand scheme of things, the economic relationship between China and Russia has more to do with energy than anything else, especially for China. This is because these countries have what's called complementary economics. China's manufacturing and exporting capabilities require a large amount of oil, natural gas, and coal, three things that Russia has an abundance of. Therefore, China buys large amounts of energy resources from Russia, and in return, Russia benefits from trade deals and income pumped into its economy. And since the war began and sanctions have led to Europe moving away from procuring energy resources from Russia, China has picked up the slack. This has helped Russia, but it's also greatly benefited China because they're able to buy more oil and natural gas at discounted prices. So the fact that Russia and China's economies are intertwined means that it's beneficial for both countries to work together to maintain economic growth. But this is only one part of the relationship between the two countries that they've cultivated over the years. Another aspect of the growing closeness between China and Russia has to do with their foreign policies. To start with, the political systems in both nations are authoritarian in nature. This means that the leaders of both Russia and China have one very similar goal: to remain in power and maintain absolute control over the population within their borders. This provides Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping some common ground to meet on. It's no wonder that the leaders have met so often. Each get-together is like a brainstorming session for how authoritarian regimes can maintain control in a world that's changing. There are differences between the Russian and Chinese governments. Putin claims his country has a multi-party system where fair elections are held, which is just Kremlin propaganda. Conversely, China is very open about its one-party system, where the Chinese Communist Party maintains absolute power. When it comes to spreading influence, both nations use similar tactics. This is sometimes done through joint operations, but most often they use their own gray zone tactics to manipulate foreign affairs. There are some major differences in foreign policy between the two nations, with Russia being much more aggressive militarily than China. A main goal that brought Russia and China closer together was to undermine democratic processes around the world. This was done by interfering with elections and manipulating mass media, such as when Russia tampered with the US presidential race in 2016. China uses its social media giants, such as TikTok, to influence the news and information people around the world see. It's not out of the realm of possibility that the relationship Xi and Putin have cultivated over the years has also resulted in the sharing of misinformation techniques and gray zone tactics. In the United Nations Security Council, China and Russia continually either support one another or at the very least will not oppose one another, although it should be noted that not all of Russia and China's foreign interests are aligned. For example, in Asia, Russia has focused its attention and resources on influencing the politics of former Soviet republics so they can mold these nations into images of itself. This can take the form of using misinformation campaigns and cyber attacks to hurt opposition to the regimes they support, or in extreme circumstances, hiring mercenaries or using military intervention to force the country in the direction they want. Putin very much desires to create a new Russian empire, which he will never be able to do if more and more former Soviet territories look to become closer to the West and adopt democratic policies. On the other hand, China is less concerned about expanding its borders or forming a traditional empire and more interested in becoming the dominant economic and influential power in Asia. Its main concern is increasing economic growth while maintaining regional security. This does not mean China is trying to conquer its neighbors and extend its borders, although this does seem to be the case with Taiwan. China dreams of a world where it can be as influential and powerful as the US. It does not want to go to war with the US, but does want to control policies on a global scale. The ambitions of China probably extend beyond just spreading economic power and influence, but its ties to Russia are based on this premise for now. When examining the relationship between the two nations, there are a couple of bumps in the road. Russia and China don't always see eye to eye, which is beneficial for the West, because a divided Russia and China are much easier to control than a unified one. This is one of the reasons that the new alliance that's being forged could be bad news for the future. So, now that talks of a stronger alliance between Russia and China have begun, is it even possible for both nations to work together effectively? China has benefited greatly from the current trajectory of the global economy. Its own economy has grown tremendously, outpacing every other nation on the planet. Its GDP is second only to the United States and is actively closing this gap as well. There's no denying that China is a global power with a lot of influence due to its economic status. Russia, however, not so much. Russia is the 9th largest economy in the world based on GDP and 6th largest by purchasing power parity, and these standings are only going to get worse as Western sanctions take hold and begin crippling their economy. Therefore, China and Russia have different perspectives on the current status quo, which has been a point of contention between their leaders. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, Chinese leaders promoted the country's economic rise as peaceful. And although China did not wage war in the traditional sense to get where it is today, there were questionable practices and egregious human rights violations carried out to ensure the economy would grow at all costs. China has intentionally avoided armed military conflicts that could lead to a larger war, especially with the United States. Instead, China uses its manufacturing power and tremendous economic wealth to create diplomatic agreements with nations worldwide that make them invaluable to foreign governments and economies. China has also used its Belt and Road Initiative to forge powerful connections in Asia and Africa, while also creating increased access to European markets. This series of roads, railways, and trade routes will carry massive amounts of goods across continents and further increase the economic growth of China. It's a powerful tool that allows China to spread its influence and increase its power without any military intervention. What all this means is that China is happy with the way things are as long as it suits them. Its economy has been continuously growing and it holds power over many governments. Entire policies and business deals have either succeeded or failed in foreign countries as a result of what China wants. And in the age of information technology, China has placed itself at the center of manufacturing, software, and web development in a way that allows them to gather information on adversaries while ensuring the world is reliant on its technology sector. Russia is less than thrilled with the current status quo. For a while now, Putin's power and influence have been slipping. And now that Russia is losing this war in Ukraine, most Western nations look at Putin's regime as a joke. He still has a firm grasp on the Russian people due to his brutal tactics of oppression and state-controlled media. However, if nothing else, the war in Ukraine has shown the rest of the world that Russia is nowhere near as powerful as Putin claimed it to be. While China oftentimes plays by the rules, or at least portrays itself as a nation that follows global norms and laws, Russia has constantly disregarded international standards. China prefers to fly under the radar, while Russia is constantly pushing its luck. This has led to a series of armed conflicts in the past and numerous sanctions being placed on Russia. It seems as if Putin does not have a long-term strategy, he just takes what he wants when he wants, or at least tries to. However, China is very much planning for the future. These contradicting national outlooks do not bode well for a prolonged alliance between the two nations. It's also clear that Russia is much more willing to use its military and threats of nuclear destruction as a way to get what it wants than China is. These aggressive tactics have not been working well for Russia, but Putin keeps doubling down on them. Both Russia and China are led by authoritarian regimes, but the way they interact with other powers on the world stage is very different. And this is one key factor that makes China hesitant to form a traditional alliance with Putin. And rightfully so. Imagine if Russia and China were true allies when Putin invaded Ukraine. China would likely have been obligated to partake in the war effort in some way. If China had begun sending troops and military assets to the front lines, the response by NATO might have been much more aggressive. Things could have escalated to the point of World War III breaking out. And you wouldn't be watching this very interesting video because we'd all be hunkered down in bunkers waiting for the end of times. But war is not what China currently wants, and by engaging in a formal alliance with Russia, the likelihood of being dragged into an armed conflict becomes much higher. This brings us to another reason why, up to this point, Russia and China have worked together but not formed a binding alliance. Besides having different methods and goals, the two nations just don't trust one another. Xi and Putin definitely talk and probably even brainstorm ideas on how to maintain their power, but overall the governments just don't trust one another, and for good reason. A ruthless authoritarian regime will do anything to keep its power, even if it means stabbing an ally in the back. China and Russia have a history of conflict, bad business deals, and differences of opinion over communist ideologies. It doesn't help that the citizens of each nation are highly nationalistic, meaning that trying to get along with another ethnic group or nationality is very difficult. When you think your country is the best and always right, it leaves little room for compromise and relationship building. Then there's the elephant in the room. China has big plans, and Russia's war in Ukraine is not helping. China's made it clear they stand with Russia even if they don't necessarily agree with the invasion of its neighbor. That being said, China has been keeping a close eye on the conflict for years now. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and the world just watched as territory was stolen from Ukraine with very limited repercussions, China took note. There is no denying that China wants the world to officially recognize Taiwan as part of its territory, but thus far, they've been unsuccessful in achieving that goal. However, if Russia could occupy and annex Crimea without much backlash, then perhaps it was possible for China to do the same with Taiwan. The Chinese leadership ramped up gray zone tactics, like conducting military drills in the South China Sea, flying aircraft into Taiwanese airspace, and threatening global leaders if they visited the island nation. Although none of these things seem to have had the desired effect, China is playing the long game. Its plan is to continue using these operations to weaken Taiwan and its ties to the West until the island can be forced to become a part of China. When Russia invaded Ukraine, China once again watched the West's reaction closely. They hoped that the war would be met with indifference by NATO and allies, which would be a very good sign if China ever wanted to take Taiwan by force. However, this is not what happened, and the way the West reacted was very bad news for China. It does not seem that Xi and his regime explicitly blame Russia for the shortcomings, but the way that NATO unified around Ukraine was not what China had hoped to see. When the war started, things seemed to proceed as expected. Sanctions were placed on Russia, but if the war ended quickly with a Russian victory, it was possible the West would eventually lift the sanctions, and a new status quo with Ukraine incorporated into Russian borders would emerge. At least this was the hope for both Russia and China. Instead, Ukrainians put up a fight that would push Russian forces away from their capital and almost all the way out of their borders. The West started sending massive amounts of aid and weapons to Ukraine. NATO ramped up its own defenses and started keeping a closer eye on authoritarian regimes around the world. Each one of those responses put a damper on China's future plans for Taiwan. The failure of Russia to quickly defeat a much smaller military and secure victory is likely a point of contention between Russia and China. One of the main goals of the relationship between the two nations is to prevent the West from spreading its ideologies further into Asia. Instead of doing this, the war in Ukraine has strengthened Western bonds and even driven once neutral nations like Sweden and Finland into the arms of NATO. Ever since the war in Ukraine, the United States has clearly voiced its resolve to protect Taiwan's sovereignty by using military force if necessary. Therefore, China sees Russia's failures in Ukraine as both being bad for their current relationship and their future plans. Now, to be fair, it has been kind of using Russia as a guinea pig. They offer little support when Russia oversteps, but do not try to stop them. Instead, China sat back and watched what happened when Russia annexed Crimea and then invaded Ukraine to see how their enemies would react so they could make adjustments to their own future plans. It's not clear whether China encourages Russia's behavior behind closed doors, but it certainly only offers limited support in the open, as China does not want to be hit with the same sanctions as Russia. The military aspect of the new alliance between China and Russia is what has the West most on edge. But what exactly are the military ties between the two nations right now? The militaries of China and Russia have never been in combat together. However, ever since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and there were half-hearted protests from the West, China and Russia have increased defensive cooperation. They collaborated to build more advanced missile warning systems, furthered space exploration, and integrated their satellite-based navigation systems. During the height of the Soviet Union, China procured most of its weapons and military vehicles from Russia, but this is no longer the case. China now constructs most of its weapons within its borders as its defense industry grows. This was necessitated by Russia withholding some of its more sophisticated weapons, as the Kremlin didn't want China to reverse engineer them. Again, this just shows the distrust between the two governments. Currently, both China and Russia are in the top 5 major arms exporters in the world. However, Russia's ability to sell weapons has been drastically reduced as it needs to throw everything it has at Ukraine just to cling to the little territory it still controls. The recent increase in joint exercises between China and Russia has allowed for more interoperability and mutual trust between their forces. But most experts agree these maneuvers are not necessarily being done to strengthen their militaries as much as they're being conducted to send a message to the West that Russia and China are willing to work together in extreme circumstances. For example, when President Biden and other members of Quad, which consists of Japan, Australia, and India, met in Tokyo in May of 2022, China and Russia flew bombers near Japanese airspace in their first joint military drill since the war in Ukraine began. Clearly, this was not just a coincidence. It was to show that China and Russia still stand together to ensure Western powers do not extend their influence further into that part of the world. So, the current relationship between China and Russia is just that, a relationship. It's not a formal alliance, much to the chagrin of Russia. It's probable that Putin would like a more formal alliance to strengthen its own position and have access to Chinese military and economic support when his own country falls short. However, Xi Jinping is not stupid and knows that Putin could drag China into a war it's not yet willing to fight against Western powers. This brings us full circle back into the most recent meeting between Wang Yi and Vladimir Putin. The statements from the conference indicate there will be more cooperation and a stronger relationship on the horizon. Does this mean there will be a formal alliance? Probably not, but the new arrangement could be bad news for NATO and other Western countries in other ways. One of the main talking points of the conversation was that China is working toward cultivating mutual political trust. Before the two nations can work together efficiently, they need to be on the same page and trust one another. Wang elaborated on this point by saying there will be more strategic coordination and cooperation around safeguarding the interests of each nation. This is a slippery slope to go down, as Vladimir Putin's interests are quite extensive and will likely result in further conflict. However, a more unified China and Russia would be a formidable foe, especially thanks to Russia's natural resources, which complement China's economic and manufacturing growth. Both sides mentioned that there would be even more joint military exercises in the future, but did not expand on where or why. These will likely continue to be used to voice displeasure over Western influence spreading closer to the Russian and Chinese borders. However, it's unclear how many military exercises Russia will be able to partake in if they're throwing everything they've got at Ukraine. And of course, China didn't miss the opportunity to blame the war in Ukraine on the West for threatening Russia's security and forcing their ideologies on others. In recent months, as China has worked to try to broker some kind of peace, it's been using this rhetoric to try to get the US and NATO to stop sending weapons and military aid to Ukraine, stating that they're just adding fuel to the fire. Obviously, China knows if the aid were to stop, Russia would have a much better chance of winning the war, or at least forcing a favorable peace treaty where they could maintain control of some of the territory they stole. So China's cries for peace are just a thinly veiled disguise to help Russia get out of catastrophic embarrassment of completely losing the war in Ukraine. Because if this were to happen, there's a good chance things could become very unstable in Russia, which would mean that all the deals and agreements between China and Russia could be put in jeopardy. If Russia is completely defeated and forced to make concessions, it would also greatly weaken its capability to help China stop the spread of Western influence further into South and East Asia. Western powers are concerned that the new relationship being forged may lead China to provide more weapons and military aid to Russia, but it was Putin's final remark that has many around the world worried. The dictator stated plans to suspend Russia's involvement in the START nuclear arms reduction treaty. This is just Putin posturing to voice his displeasure over his failed attempt to take Ukraine and the aid the West is sending. He's like a little kid throwing a tantrum because he can't get what he wants. Yet this is still a dangerous proposition. No good can come from amassing huge stores of nuclear weapons. In a nuclear war, no one will win. The treaty itself limits the number of deployed intercontinental missiles that the US and Russia can have at any given time. This agreement was created to act as a deterrent to nuclear war without creating more nuclear weapons. What the talks and a new relationship between Russia and China really come down to is that both authoritarian regimes don't want to lose their power. If Western ideologies continue to spread, they'll threaten the very fabric that Russia and China are built on. Both countries still have different objectives, but neither can realize their goals if more and more nations flock toward democratic systems and ally themselves with the West. The leadership of China and Russia know that if they're going to maintain their current way of life, they'll need to work more closely with one another in the coming years. This is why the talks were based around maintaining a positive relationship and working toward further cooperation between the two nations. Wang summed all this up when he said that China and Russia will resolutely oppose any unilateral or bullying behavior and unswervingly safeguard their respective sovereignty, security, and development interests. The current regimes in China and Russia don't want to give up their power. Many in the governments truly believe that an authoritarian rule is the best way to do things. Obviously, the people themselves may disagree with this, which is why the leaders of the countries fear Western democratic ideas. The discussions between Russian and Chinese leadership are based on working together to act as a unified front against the spread of Western ideologies. Neither country will be able to do this alone, so any future alliance between the two nations will be forged out of necessity. Now watch why China is about to collapse, or check this other video out that's recommended just for you.